Welcome to Chapter 8 on Bop. To get started here, I want to bring your attention to some things to look for and listen to across this bottom line, and draw your attention to the playlist that we keep creating to work towards the final listening exam. Here's your required listening, about 24 minutes for this week. I think you're going to enjoy it. And then there's loads, maybe 5 hours of additional listening that might be helpful. Shorter selections, and then there's some full albums. I think you would enjoy that. Before we get started, I just want to ask if you're aware of these at the end that I keep adding, just to give you a sense of who these guys are. And with no further ado, let's get started here on Chapter 8. Let's see. Chapter 8. So, bop or bebop, rebop. The name comes from a common phrase that was sung with the words bebop, da-da-da bebop, like that. Okay, and there was a shift to bop. It brought more significant changes to jazz, both musical and non-musical, than any other in jazz history. The rise of small combos came about because of the demise of big bands, and bop captured that nervous, agitated state of the United States at this time, and it particularly reflected African American defiance. It helped to establish the African American identity, musically that is, and it was established deeply in this new style. It was somewhat a reaction of white bands co-opting earlier jazz styles and then being more successful in those than the people who had created it. Bop separated itself from popular white music. It incorporated all kinds of things: a nonconformist persona, an anti-war feeling, an anti-commercialism. Anti-commercialism. It was exclusive, and along with that came some other things that weren't so positive, like late night life and drug use. This was the first jazz style that wasn't suitable for dancing. It spoke to a more elite audience. It was complex. It was very technical. It was intellectual. It stretched harmonic boundaries with chord recognition, with chord extensions, with chord substitution. It was fast and very, very demanding. When it emerged, it was not accepted enthusiastically, and now it's considered mainstream jazz. The short stylized solos of the swing era no longer sufficed. So these young players found that swing was kind of cliched, and they were tired of it, and they thought it lacked in freedom of expression and exploration, particularly in improvised solos. Bop players felt that many swing players were earning more than their share of wealth and fame based on their lack of creativity. Bop required small combos, and that resembled the earlier Dixieland bands. In fact, they were a lot like them because they had a rhythm section and then a front line, or usually one or two wind players. I want to draw your attention to this interactive guide, number 6, that'll help orient you towards the changes in Bop that Bop brought. And like other times, Bop had no firm beginning. It began in New York in the early 1940s, but at the same time it was also heard in other places in the country. For example, Buster Smith was doing Bop in Dallas. Charlie Christian was doing it in the Southwest. Jimmy Blanton in St. Louis. We also see it in Oklahoma City and Kansas City and other places. The developing mainstream and the jazz canon. So when you refer to canon, that's a historical category of works that are descriptive of an evolutionary line of how something develops. It describes the heroes, the values. It offers criteria for judging new work. And what happens is, in the rearview mirror, this is kind of codified after seeing what pieces or what works earn the worthiness through general consensus. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the canon. The transition to Bop was of great magnitude. Of course, jazz lost a lot of popularity because of it. It was extremely different, but it did reach art status, and in retrospect, we can see a lot of heroes. The composers, the arrangers were on the cutting edge. Early jazz occurred mostly in dance halls, in the street, and church. Currently, jazz is seen on concert stages in universities and is the subject of lots of historical accounts. The giants that emerged from Bop era, they were They used a small group, but that proved to be the medium of best expression for their personal voices, for improvisation, and for an interactive um, interaction amongst the group. Okay, bop arranging. So notation for bop bands were confined to unison lines. Okay, so they would have the first chorus in unison, usually a trumpet and a saxophone, and then often that would be repeated. Then there would be improvised choruses, and then the unison chorus would come back. And so form-wise, that looked like this: A, A, B, A. A unison, repeat that unison, improvised choruses, and then a unison. And altogether that laid out into 32 bars. Musical expansion. What we're talking about here is the chordal aspect of it, the harmonies, okay? So classical composers by this time had been known for a long time to experiment with the upper register of the chord. For example, you build simple triads on the 1, the 3rd, and the 5th scale degree. And with blues and so forth, the 7th was very common. But here we move into adding the 9th, the 11th, the 13th. And we talked about blue notes in that first couple of weeks, being the 3rd and the 7th. But by this era, the flat 5th was just as standard as the 3rd and the 7th was. There was also use of polychords. This is a combination of 2 conventional chords that sit on top of one another, or one sits on top of the other. These were new complex chords, and they substituted for simpler chords that were used in standard tunes. And the result of all this, the extended harmonies, the chord substitution, the polychords, was a fresh, stimulating new kind of work called bop. Also, you need to listen for how fast the tempos are. Okay, so the musicians used lots and lots of 16th notes. They just flew. And they often accented the note between the beats. For example, so that offbeat got lots and lots of attention, and that drove the music. There was more tension in this music. There were tonal clashes, unusual harmonies, complex rhythm, hectic tempos, rapidly moving chords. The widespread practice of creating a new tune from the chords of an existing standard was very common. You couldn't identify the standard because the original melody was never stated. They began improvising immediately as soon as they hit the ground. And oftentimes they used uneven, asymmetrical phrases. Do some listening here. Moving on to the rhythm section. Okay, the first thing we're going to take on is that there was no more 4/4 steady rhythm with the whole group providing that rhythm. It underwent radical changes, in fact. Let's start with the drum. So the drum largely had an 8th note pattern, 8th note rhythm on the cymbal. The snare and the bass were used for accents as opposed to the boom, 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 choom, 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 choom. So it was used for accents and punctuation, and particularly accents on beat 4, either at the end of every bar or every other bar. The bass drum was also used for bombs, punctuating really accented places. Okay, piano players, they went from using like left chord, left hand root chord like that, to a syncopated chord punctuations. Count Basie had been doing this for a long time, so it wasn't really new. He had introduced it. The guitar, started using an amplifier, which allowed it to become capable of delivering melodies, which made it equal to soloing like a trumpet could, or a sax, or a trombone. The string bass, oh boy, it took on more responsibility, okay? It started providing the steady beat. Its lines were more interesting, and they often used a walking bass line, which meant they had a new note almost on every beat. There wasn't any more duplication of parts or roles, all the players keeping the beat for dancing. And this style was foreshadowed by Basie, Jimmy Blanton, Charles Christian, Benny Goodman. And another thing that you want to talk about here is adding rhythms. Rhythm players from Cuba and cross rhythms, more emphasis on Latin rhythms. Lots of performers that we want to look at: Dizzy Gillespie, trumpeter; Charlie Parker, saxophone player; drummers Kenneth Clark, Mac Roach; pianist Thelonious Monk, Teddy Hill. A lot of things happened at the Minton's Playhouse in New York City, and what became popular was jam sessions, where you'd have a good contemporary nucleus of players that were pretty advanced, and then other people would come and sit in with them. Um, and a lot of swing players tried to join this, but they got left out because if they were unwanted, the group would just play ferociously fast and use strange chord changes, and the swing players would just get discouraged and leave. First person up is Dizzy Gillespie, and we can't talk about Dizzy without talking about his mentor, which was Roy Eldridge. Roy Eldridge learned from Louis Armstrong. Roy played a very fiery style. He was a virtuoso, and he had an extreme upper range. He brought exciting, refreshing new musical lines, and he played with all the big bands: Fletcher Henderson, Gene Krupa, Artie Shaw, and what came out of that was Dizzy Gillespie, who was really a great temper player. We're going to listen to lots of his music, or make that available. We move on to Charlie Parker here. Charlie Parker is a giant in this era. He was known as Yardbird, or simply Bird. His influences were Lester Young, Buster Smith. He also credited 5 different white players, 2 who weren't even jazzers. But Parker surpassed them all, everybody who had come before him. His method of learning was to stand in the alley when he was 15 years old behind the Reno Club in Kansas City and listen to Count Basie's band. So he would listen and imitate. Later, when he was a little bit older, he studied advanced harmony, piano, guitar, and those are good ways to get grounded in harmony, and this deep knowledge of harmonic structure helped open up this world of bop for him in the way he soloed. So by age 18, he went to New York City. That was about 1939, to see if he could join some jam sessions. He was already mature enough to be playing double time. He supported himself by doing menial jobs, such as washing dishes. But eventually he joined the J. McShann Band, 1940 to 42. And when he took off with them to tour, he was just a child. And when he returned as a mature musician. The earliest recordings that we know about are Hootie's Blues and Sepia and Bounce. He was briefly with the Earl Hines Band before it collapsed, and then he went with Billy Eckstine, a great singer, who also picked up Miles Davis in 1944. And when Miles Davis and Bird got together, modern jazz, or bop, was born. The hot spot in New York for bop music was New York's 52nd Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. So Bird led a band there at the Spotlight Club on 52nd Street, do some listening of all of this music. After World War II, he could command a $1,200 weekly salary, when previously he could only, he struggled to get a $2 salary for a couple of days. Okay, he suffered from illness, particularly drugs, alcohol, ulcers from that, and he became unreliable because of these addictions, and his employment opportunities waned. He made it his mission to counsel other people to stay away from this stuff. He died young at age 33. He also had a broken heart from losing a young daughter. He excelled at slow blues and fast tempos, and during his lifetime, his music was poorly understood. But nobody did more for the history of jazz at this era. Let's see, lots of listening there. We want to move on to Bud Powell. Bud Powell was probably the chief pianist from this era. He was just wickedly good at reading, and he won prizes as a child. His advanced technique was just it blew everyone away. Everybody recognized his talent. He had great left-hand voicings. The spacing of the notes were unique. They were fresh, innovative, a genius in him, and it influenced all the others. He could play accurately at very fast tempos. He had high energy. He also suffered from mental illness. We're going to talk about Thelonious Monk, born right here in Rocky Mount, and he's somebody you need to get familiar with. And we're going to move along to trombonist J.J. Johnson. Looking at Billy Eckstine's band, some of the bands, he had Sarah Vaughan as his vocalist, and she was quite well known. Stan Kenton's band was also good, and Dizzy's band was great. And then that Latin jazz influence, need to listen to some of that, including Tito Puente. And that's the week. Lots to unpack.